Sir, if you don't leave that seat right now, airport security will remove you from this aircraft in front of everyone.
Sir, if you don't leave that seat right now, airport security will remove you from this aircraft in front of everyone. Lauren Brooks delivered the words without blinking her voice, cutting clean across the silent first-class cabin. Every passenger in the row went still. Jack Sullivan, 42 years old, dressed in a plain shirt and worn jeans, did not flinch. He reached down, lifted his boarding pass from the tray table, and placed it face up, where Lauren could not ignore it. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. 5 minutes later, before the cabin door had even closed, a series of urgent calls flooded the cockpit, and every member of that crew went pale. Jack Sullivan had learned a long time ago that the way a man carried himself in a room said more than anything he could put on paper. He was 42 years old, and he had stopped caring what a room thought of him somewhere around the time he realized that the people who judged fastest were usually the ones who understood least. He wore what he wore because it was clean, and it fit dark jeans, a plain button-down shirt, leather shoes that had seen a few too many miles. His carry-on was a canvas duffel, his laptop bag older than most of the flight attendants working Sterling Air's morning routes. He looked like a man who fixed things for a living, and in a way he did. The gate for Sterling Air Flight 417 to New York was already crowded when Jack arrived. The flight was scheduled to depart at 9:45 in the morning, and the boarding announcement for first class had just come through the overhead speakers. Jack moved through the line without urgency, boarding pass in hand, the kind of man who had flown enough times not to rush a process that always ended the same way. His seat was confirmed 2A, the window position in the first row of the first-class cabin. He had booked it 3 weeks earlier for a meeting that could not be rescheduled with people who did not wait. He found his seat without help, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, and settled in. The cabin was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that only lasts until the rest of the passengers start boarding. Jack opened his laptop, pulled up a document he had been reviewing for the better part of a week, and let the noise of the gate behind him fall away. He was not thinking about the seat, or the flight, or the airline. He was thinking about the meeting in New York, the numbers on the screen in front of him, and whether the terms they had negotiated were going to hold. Lauren Brooks noticed him the moment she walked the cabin for her pre-boarding check. She was the senior flight attendant on this route, sharp-eyed and precise in the way that came from years of learning which passengers needed managing before they became problems. She had a way of reading a cabin that had nothing to do with names on a manifest and everything to do with appearances. A man in jeans with a canvas duffel sitting in 2A read to her as an error, either a mistake in the booking system or someone who had gotten lucky on an upgrade and didn't quite know how to wear it yet. She made a mental note and moved on, but the note stayed with her. Ryan Cooper, the first-class cabin supervisor, was running through the pre-departure checklist at the forward galley when Lauren passed him her assessment with a look. The two of them had worked together long enough to communicate without words. Ryan glanced toward 2A, took in the same picture Lauren had, and went back to his checklist with his mouth set in a thin line. Neither of them said anything yet. They didn't need to. The flight was still boarding, and they had learned over the years that it was easier to manage these things early before the cabin filled, and every adjustment became a production. Evelyn Carter came through the jet bridge at 9:22. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in a charcoal blazer and tailored trousers that announced themselves before she spoke. She was the kind of woman who treated first-class cabins the way other people treated their living rooms, as a space that belonged to her by some unspoken agreement with the universe. She had flown Sterling Air's New York route at least twice a month for the past 4 years, and in that time she had accumulated enough loyalty points and enough goodwill with the regular crew that certain things had become informal expectations. One of those things was the window seat in the first row. She had never once arrived to find someone already sitting in it. At the entrance to the jet bridge, a gate agent scanned her boarding pass and directed her toward the aircraft. Her confirmed seat was 4C in the business class section, But Evelyn Carter had not sat in business class in 3 years, and she did not intend to start today. She walked past the business class rows without slowing, nodded to Lauren at the cabin door as she entered first class, and moved directly toward row 2. The gate agent at the bridge had not stopped her. Lauren, standing just inside the door, had seen her walk past the business class section and said nothing. This was in the small and unexamined way that systems fail how it began. She stopped at the entrance to the first class section. Her eyes went straight to row 2. The man in the window seat had a laptop open and did not look up. Evelyn turned to Lauren, who was standing just inside the cabin door, and said nothing. She simply looked at her, the way a person looks at a problem they expect someone else to solve immediately. Lauren moved toward the row with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a task she considered routine. She stopped beside 2A and addressed Jack in a low-level voice. "Sir, I think there may be some confusion about your seat assignment. Could I take a look at your boarding pass?" Jack closed his laptop, halfway reached into the front pocket of his bag, and handed the boarding pass to Lauren without comment. She looked at it. The confirmation was clear. Seat 2 of first class. Flight 417 booked and paid in full under the name Jack Sullivan. She looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary, and then she handed it back. "I'm going to need to check this against our system," she said. "There may have been a duplicate assignment." Jack took the boarding pass back. "There wasn't," he said. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago. The confirmation number is on the pass if you need it." Lauren did not respond to that directly. She turned, went back to the galley, and Ryan met her halfway. They kept their voices low, but the forward cabin was small, and the ambient noise had not yet built to the level that would have swallowed their exchange. Evelyn was standing in the aisle 2 rows back, watching with her arms crossed and her carry-on still in her hand, making no move to find an alternative seat. Ryan walked to the row and introduced himself to Jack with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Ryan Cooper, the cabin supervisor. I apologize for any inconvenience. We have a situation where a long-standing premium passenger has the same seat assignment, and we'd like to offer you an alternative seat in first class. Same service, same amenities, while we sort out the discrepancy in our system." Jack looked at Ryan the way a man looks at a sentence that doesn't add up. "There's no discrepancy," he said. "My ticket is valid. The seat is assigned to me. If there's a duplicate, the system will show when each booking was made, and mine will be earlier." He set his boarding pass back on the tray table so it remained visible. "I'm not moving." Ryan's smile tightened. He was not accustomed to that answer in this cabin. Most passengers, when offered an alternative with enough warmth and professional language, accepted it as a reasonable compromise. Jack was not most passengers, and the offer had not landed as a compromise. It had landed as what it was, which was a request to give up something he had already paid for. Evelyn stepped forward from where she had been standing and addressed Ryan directly, as though Jack were not present. "I have been flying this route for 4 years, she said. "I have always had this seat. I don't know who this man is or how he ended up here, but I should not have to stand in the aisle while this is being sorted out." Her voice carried the particular tone of someone who had been deferred to long enough that she had come to expect it as the natural order of things. Jack did not look at Evelyn when she spoke. He looked at Ryan. "She doesn't have a seat assignment for this row," he said. "Her confirmed seat is somewhere behind us. If it weren't, you would have already shown me the conflict in the system. You haven't because there isn't one." He kept his voice flat and direct, not aggressive, not loud the way a man speaks when he knows he is right and has no interest in performing it. "Check the manifest. Run the confirmation number. You'll get the same result every time." Ryan held his position for a moment, then stepped back toward the galley. Lauren was already on the phone with the gate desk, her voice carrying just enough urgency to make the other passengers in the first rows glance up from their phones. The cabin was filling now, and the situation at the front had started to draw the kind of attention that people on planes quietly observe while pretending not to. 2 rows back, a man in a gray jacket had his phone angled at the front of the cabin. He was not being obvious about it. He had tilted the screen down slightly and kept his face neutral. He had seen this kind of thing before, and he understood instinctively that what was happening at the front of the cabin was the kind of thing that looked different on a screen than it did in person. Cleaner, starker, easier to read. Evelyn did not sit down. She remained in the aisle with her carry-on at her feet, radiating the kind of impatience that was designed to make everyone around her feel responsible for resolving her discomfort. She said to Lauren loudly enough for the nearby rows to hear, "This is completely unacceptable. I have a meeting to get to, and I'm not going to be held up by someone who clearly doesn't belong in this section." Jack heard that. He turned his head and looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. His expression did not change. He said, "I have a boarding pass, a confirmation number, and a paid seat assignment. If you have the same, then we have a system error, and the airline needs to resolve it. If you don't have the same, then you don't have a claim." He turned back to face the front without waiting for a response. Evelyn's face shifted in a way that made it clear she was not accustomed to being answered like that. She looked to Lauren, then to Ryan with an expression that was both an accusation and a demand. The silence she held was louder than anything she might have said next. Ryan came back from the galley with the look of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with, but intended to execute anyway. He stood at the end of the row and addressed Jack in a lower register, the kind of tone meant to feel both confidential and firm. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your frustration, and I want you to know we take your booking seriously. However, given the circumstances, I'm going to need to ask you to move to seat 3A while we resolve this through proper channels. We'll have answers for you before departure." Jack looked at him steadily. "No," he said. Ryan was quiet for a beat. "Sir." "No," Jack said again. "I'm not moving to a different seat while you figure out whether my valid paid confirmed seat belongs to me. That's not how this works. If the airline has an error, the airline needs to fix it, not ask me to absorb the cost of it while I wait." He reopened his laptop. "I'll be here when you're ready." Ryan straightened. The professionalism in his expression had cured into something harder. He looked at Lauren, who was standing just behind him, and gave her a small nod. She picked up the internal phone in the forward galley and made a call. Jack did not need to hear the words to understand what was being set in motion. He had been in enough rooms where people decided to escalate rather than accept that they were wrong. He knew what came next. He looked at the boarding pass sitting face up on the tray table, then back at his screen. The numbers in his document were still the same. The meeting in New York was still at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He had done nothing wrong, and he intended to do nothing differently. Whatever was coming through that cabin door next, he would handle it the same way he had handled the last 10 minutes, without raising his voice, without leaving his seat, and without giving an inch on something that was already his. Outside on the jet bridge, a door opened. Captain Samuel Harris was a man who had spent 23 years in the air and had learned to trust his crew the way he trusted his instruments, without second-guessing, without delay. He was methodical, experienced, and deeply committed to running a clean operation. What he was not on this particular morning was someone who had time to stand in the first-class cabin and arbitrate a seating dispute 40 minutes before departure. When Lauren's call came through to the cockpit, he listened to her version of the situation, asked 2 questions, and made his decision before he had all the facts. That was the mistake. It didn't look like a mistake at the time. It rarely does. He came through the forward galley door with the particular bearing of a man whose uniform still commanded a room, even when he wasn't trying. The first-class cabin went quieter when he appeared. Ryan stepped aside. Lauren positioned herself near the galley entrance. Evelyn, who had finally taken a temporary seat in 3A while the situation was being handled, straightened when she saw him come in. Harris stopped at row 2 and looked at Jack. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, keeping his voice even. I'm Captain Harris. I've been briefed on the situation, and I want to resolve this before we push back. I'm going to ask you one more time to move to an alternate seat in this cabin while our ground team verifies the booking details. Jack looked up from his laptop. He had heard this framing before one more time, as though he had already been unreasonable a dozen times, and this was a final courtesy. Captain, he said, I've shown my boarding pass to 2 members of your crew. The seat assignment is valid. The confirmation number is on the pass. I've asked them to run it against the manifest, and they haven't done that in front of me. I'm not going to move from a seat I paid for because it's more convenient for the airline to ask me to wait somewhere else. Harris kept his expression steady. I understand your position, he said, but I have a responsibility to the safety and comfort of everyone on this aircraft, and right now, this situation is creating a disruption. I need you to cooperate. Jack closed his laptop fully and set it on the seat beside him. Verifying a seat assignment takes less than 2 minutes, he said. If you pull up the manifest right now, you will see my name on seat 2A with a booking date of 3 weeks ago. That's not a disruption, that's a resolution. The disruption is that your crew is choosing not to do that. He was not raising his voice. He was not leaning forward. He delivered every sentence the way a man delivers facts without decoration, without apology. Harris looked at him for a long moment. In 23 years, he had handled medical emergencies at 35,000 feet equipment failures over the Atlantic and passengers who had made threats serious enough to require federal involvement. A man sitting quietly in a seat and declining to move was not a safety issue. Somewhere in the back of his mind, something registered that this situation wasn't going the way it should, but he had already committed to a course of action in front of his crew, and reversing it now in the middle of a full cabin felt like a different kind of problem. He made the wrong call for the right-sounding reason. Mr. Sullivan, he said, I'm the commanding officer of this aircraft, and I'm formally requesting that you move to the seat my crew has indicated. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to involve airport security. Jack looked at him. Then involve them, he said, because I'm not leaving this seat. The man in the gray jacket 2 rows back had not put his phone down. He had shifted his angle slightly, making sure the forward row stayed in frame. He was not the only one. Across the aisle, in 2B, a woman had her phone flat against her armrest screen facing forward. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Airport security arrived within 4 minutes. 2 officers in blue uniforms who came through the jet bridge with the practiced neutrality of people who had been called into dozens of situations exactly like this one. They listened to Lauren's summary at the galley entrance, nodded, and walked to row 2. The taller of the 2 officers addressed Jack directly. Sir, the airline has requested that you deplane. We're going to need you to come with us. Jack gathered his things without argument. He closed his laptop, zipped his bag, and stood up from seat 2A with the boarding pass still in his hand. He did not make a scene. He did not raise his voice or appeal to the other passengers or say anything dramatic as he moved toward the front of the cabin. He walked out of that aircraft the same way he had walked in, without performance, without urgency, with the quiet self-possession of a man who had already decided how this was going to end and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Evelyn Carter moved into seat 2A before the jet bridge door had finished closing behind him. The cabin settled. Lauren and Ryan exchanged a look that said the problem had been handled. Harris returned to the cockpit. The boarding process resumed, as though the previous 30 minutes had been a minor administrative delay, rather than a man being removed from a seat he had legally purchased and paid for. The remaining passengers went back to their phones and their headphones, and the particular self-contained silence of people who had witnessed something uncomfortable and chosen not to examine it too closely. Except for the 2 who had been recording. The video went up at 9:47 in the morning, 2 minutes after the scheduled departure time. It was posted by the man in the gray jacket, whose name was David Mercer, a software consultant from Chicago who had been flying first class on Sterling Air for the past 6 years. He posted it without commentary, with a single line of text that read, "Watched a man with a valid ticket get escorted off a plane this morning so a woman who didn't have his seat could take it. Flight 417 out of Chicago. Draw your own conclusions." The clip was 1 minute and 43 seconds long. It showed Lauren telling Jack to move Ryan's offer of an alternative seat, Jack's calm refusal, Harris's arrival and formal warning, and finally, Jack walking out with his bag and his boarding pass still in his hand. It did not show anything that needed to be explained or contextualized. It was exactly what it looked like. By 10:15, the video had been shared 11,000 times. By 10:40, it had crossed 100,000. Sterling Air's customer service account began receiving messages at a rate that overwhelmed the automated response system within the first hour. The hashtag that attached itself to the clip was not flattering. It was also not inaccurate. Back inside the terminal, Jack Sullivan was standing at the Sterling Air customer service desk with his boarding pass on the counter and his phone to his ear. He had already made 2 calls. The first was to his assistant in New York, who was rearranging the afternoon schedule. The second was to a direct line he did not often use, belonging to a man named Gerald Finch, who was Sterling Air's Senior Vice President of Corporate Partnerships. Jack had met Gerald Finch 8 months earlier, at the beginning of a negotiation that had been ongoing ever since a partnership agreement between Jack's company and Sterling Air, worth at its current valuation somewhere in the range of $40 million. The contract was scheduled to be finalized at the New York meeting that afternoon. Gerald Finch picked up on the second ring. Jack gave him a straightforward account of what had happened. He did not editorialize. He told Gerald the flight number, the seat assignment, the names of the crew members involved, as he had observed them, and the fact that he was currently standing in Terminal C, having been walked off the aircraft by airport security for declining to give up a seat he had paid for. He said it the way he said everything, without drama, without heat, which somehow made it worse to hear. Gerald Finch said very little during the call. When Jack finished, Gerald said, "I'll call you back in 10 minutes. The call ended. What happened in the next 10 minutes was not visible from the terminal floor, but it moved fast. Gerald Finch went first to Sterling Air's chief operating officer, whose name was Patricia Holloway, and whose office was on the 14th floor of the Sterling Air headquarters building on the west side of Chicago. Patricia Holloway had already been forwarded the video by her communications director, who had flagged it at 10:22 as a potential crisis-level exposure event. When Gerald Finch called and identified the man in the video as the principal stakeholder in the airline's largest pending corporate deal, Patricia Holloway's response was immediate and unambiguous. She pulled up the booking manifest for Flight 417 herself. Seat 2. A Jack Sullivan booked 22 days ago, paid in full. No flags, no errors, no duplicate assignment. She pulled Evelyn Carter's profile next. Evelyn had a confirmed seat in business class, 4C, not first class, not 2A. She had not been assigned seat 2A at any point. She had walked past her assigned section, entered a cabin she had no ticket for, and leveraged her frequent flyer status and her tone of voice to have the airline remove the rightful passenger on her behalf. No one at the gate or at the cabin door had stopped her because no one had checked. Patricia Holloway did not send an email. She picked up the phone and called the gate directly. The aircraft was still at the gate. Departure had been delayed while the crew completed a paperwork correction related to the boarding sequence. The gate agent transferred the call to the aircraft's internal line. Lauren Brooks answered. What Patricia said on that call was brief and specific. Lauren's expression, visible to Ryan from across the galley, changed in a way that made him set down what he was holding and give her his full attention. When Lauren hung up, she turned to Ryan, and for the first time that morning, neither of them had anything to say. The call to Captain Harris came separately, directly from the operations center. It was not a suggestion. By the time Harris emerged from the cockpit, there were already 2 people from Sterling Air's ground operations team walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. They were not there to help with boarding. The suspension notices were delivered digitally time-stamped at 10:51 in the morning, before the aircraft had pushed back from the gate. Lauren Brooks, Ryan Cooper, and Captain Samuel Harris each received formal notification of immediate administrative suspension pending investigation, with language that made the likely outcome clear to anyone who had read one of these documents before. The grounds cited were failure to verify passenger documentation, removal of a ticketed passenger without cause and conduct inconsistent with Sterling Air's equal treatment policy. Evelyn Carter was asked to deplane. A gate agent collected her carry-on from the overhead compartment of seat 2A and walked her back through the jet bridge without ceremony. She did not go quietly, but the terminal is a public place, and by that hour, there were people in it who recognized her from the video that was still spreading across every platform that carried video. She did not say anything that improved her situation. At 10:53, Jack Sullivan's phone rang. It was Gerald Finch calling back as promised. "We need you back at that gate," Gerald said. "The airline is sending someone to you right now." "I'm sorry this happened, Jack. I am genuinely sorry." Jack listened. He did not say that it was fine because it was not fine. He said, "I know," and left it at that. He picked up his bag from the customer service counter, where it had been sitting beside his laptop case and his worn boarding pass, and he walked back through Terminal C toward the gate. Around him, the airport moved the way airports always move, indifferent and continuous, 1,000 small departures happening all at once. He did not look like a man who had just changed the trajectory of 3 careers and the reputation of a major airline. He looked like a man who needed to catch a flight to New York and had been made to wait longer than he should have. The gate door was still open. The aircraft departed Chicago at 11:22 in the morning, 37 minutes behind schedule. Jack Sullivan was in seat 2A. The cabin around him was quieter than it had been before, the particular quiet of a space where something significant had happened, and the people remaining in it were still processing what they had witnessed. A few passengers glanced at him when he settled back in, looked away, and returned to their screens. He did not open his laptop immediately. He sat for a moment with his bag stowed and his hands resting on the armrests, looking out the window at the tarmac, moving slowly beneath the aircraft, and he let the last 2 hours settle into something he could carry without it weighing more than it needed to. He did not feel triumphant. That was the part that people who had not been through something like this always got wrong. The assumption that being proven right felt like winning. What it actually felt like was tired. He had spent the better part of 2 hours holding a position that should never have been challenged, in a space where the rules had been written down and were available to anyone who cared to look at them, and he had done it alone, while the people with authority made decisions that suited their preferences rather than the facts. Being right had cost him time, composure, and the kind of low-grade exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained, deliberate stillness in the face of pressure designed to make you move. When the aircraft leveled out above the cloud line, he finally opened his laptop and returned to the document he had been reviewing when all of this started. He got to New York. The meeting happened. The terms held. While Jack was in the air, Sterling Air was burning on the ground. By noon, the video posted by David Mercer had crossed 400,000 views and was being picked up by news aggregators on both coasts. By 1 in the afternoon, 2 national outlets had run digital pieces under headlines that did not require much editorial creativity. A man with a valid first-class ticket had been escorted off a plane by airport security so that a wealthier-looking passenger could take his seat, and the airline's own crew had facilitated it without verifying a single document properly. The facts, as laid out by the video and confirmed within hours by Sterling Air's own booking records, were not in dispute. That made it worse, not better. There was no alternate interpretation to offer, no miscommunication to cite, no version of events in which the airline came out looking reasonable. The manifest said what it said. The video showed what it showed. Patricia Holloway spent most of that afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor, with Sterling Air's legal team communications director and 3 members of the board who had cleared their schedules the moment the story crossed from social media into mainstream news coverage. The conversation was not about whether the airline had done something wrong. That question had already been answered by the manifest, the video, and the suspension notices that had gone out before 11 in the morning. The conversation was about what happened next and how quickly it happened, and whether the company could get ahead of a narrative that was already running faster than they could manage it. The communications director, a precise woman named Sandra Fields, laid out the situation without softening it. Sterling Air's customer satisfaction scores had been trending upward for the past 3 quarters. A single incident of this visibility, a paying passenger removed without cause at the request of a crew that had not verified documentation in front of a cabin full of people with phones, could reverse that progress in a way that took years to repair. Advertisers were already sending quiet inquiries. 2 corporate accounts had reached out to their relationship managers, asking for calls. The social media environment showed no signs of cooling on its own, and every hour without a substantive public response was being read as confirmation of guilt rather than due diligence. The board member who spoke first was a man named Raymond Cole, who had been on Sterling Air's board for 11 years and had the particular patience of someone who had outlasted several of these moments before. He said, "We need to hear from Mr. Sullivan before we decide anything public. Whatever we say has to be consistent with whatever agreement we reach with him. We cannot afford to get those out of sequence." No one in the room disagreed. Patricia Holloway had already placed a second call to Gerald Finch while Jack was in the air. Gerald had confirmed that Jack was not engaging legal counsel and had expressed no interest in a financial settlement. That piece of information was both reassuring and slightly unnerving. A man who was not asking for money in a situation this clean was either planning something larger or operating on a set of principles that made him harder to predict than someone with a straightforward number in mind. They would find out which one it was when Jack landed. Lauren Brooks received her suspension notice at 10:51 in the morning and spent the next 6 hours in a state of controlled disbelief that gradually curdled into something closer to dread. She had worked for Sterling Air for 9 years. She had received commendations. She had never had a formal complaint filed against her that had not been resolved in her favor. She sat in her apartment that afternoon, with her phone face down on the table, and tried to construct a version of the morning's events in which she had done the reasonable thing, the professional thing, the thing any experienced senior flight attendant would have done under similar circumstances. The problem was that the video existed. She had watched it twice before she made herself stop. It was not a version of events, it was the events. She could see herself in the frame standing beside seat 2A, with her chin slightly raised, addressing a man who was holding valid documentation and asking him to move as though the documentation were incidental. She had not checked the manifest in front of him. She had not pulled up the booking system and compared timestamps. She had looked at a boarding pass, confirmed it was valid, and then looked at Evelyn Carter standing in the aisle and made a decision about which passenger's comfort mattered more. The video did not require a caption. It said exactly what it showed. What made it harder to watch the second time was not the accusation it implied, it was the fact that she already knew the accusation was accurate. Ryan Cooper called her at 3 in the afternoon. She let it go to voicemail. Whatever Ryan had to say, she already knew the shape of it. They would either find a shared version of events that distributed responsibility more evenly, or they would each carry their own portion of it alone. She had spent 9 years in a cabin learning to read people, and the one thing she had failed to read that morning was the cost of the choice she had made in the first 30 seconds of seeing Jack Sullivan in seat 2A. She had decided who he was before she had verified anything. That was the beginning, and it was also she was starting to understand the end. Captain Samuel Harris did not call anyone. He sat in his car in the airport parking structure for 40 minutes after the aircraft returned from New York later that evening, with the engine off and his hands resting on the steering wheel. He was not a man who made excuses for himself easily. He had committed to a decision in the cabin without running the verification himself, because he had trusted his crew, and because overruling them in the moment would have felt like undermining them in front of a full cabin. Those were reasons. They were not justifications. He knew the difference, and he had known it for 23 years, which made the distinction harder to ignore rather than easier. He had prided himself on being the last line of accountability on any aircraft he commanded. Today, he had been the final authority who ratified someone else's mistake and made it official. When the formal review began, he intended to say exactly that, not to distribute blame or seek sympathy, but because it was what the situation required of him. And he had always believed that what a situation required was what you gave it. It would not save his position. He was not operating under the illusion that it would. Evelyn Carter did not issue a statement that day or the next. Her publicist released a brief note 3 days later, acknowledging that the situation had been deeply regrettable, and that she had relied on information provided by airline staff in understanding the seating arrangement. The note did not include an apology to Jack Sullivan. The absence was noted widely and commented on at length. Her professional reputation, built over 2 decades in the corporate consulting space, took damage that careful language could not contain. Several speaking engagements that had been confirmed were quietly canceled in the weeks that followed. Business contacts who had once returned her calls promptly began taking longer and then stopped responding at the speed they once had. Reputation is not a structure you can repair overnight. It erodes gradually and restores at a different pace entirely, if it restores at all. Sterling Air's public statement went out at 6 in the evening on the day of the incident. It was written by Sandra Fields and approved by Patricia Holloway and the board within 40 minutes of the final draft. It acknowledged without qualification that Jack Sullivan had been wrongfully removed from his assigned seat, that the airline's own verification procedures had not been followed, and that the crew members involved had been suspended pending formal review. It stated that Sterling Air held itself to a standard of equal treatment for all passengers, regardless of appearance status or tenure with the airline, and that this incident had represented a failure of that standard that the company took full responsibility for. The statement did not attempt to reframe what had happened or reach for language that softened the facts. That counted for something, even if the immediate response online did not reflect it. Jack Sullivan met with Patricia Holloway and Gerald Finch 2 days after the incident in a conference room at Sterling Air's headquarters. He came alone with no legal representation and no prepared demands. He sat down across from both of them and said what he had come to say in plain language without preamble. He did not want a financial settlement. He was not interested in litigation. What he wanted was specific and structural a public apology directed at him by name issued by the airline's CEO rather than the communications department. A full review and retraining of Sterling Air's passenger verification procedures so that no crew member would ever again be in a position to remove a passenger without running a documented check against the manifest first. A formal policy written and published, establishing that seat assignments were to be honored on the basis of documentation alone, regardless of a passenger's appearance, status, or frequency of travel. And an end to any informal practice of allowing loyalty program status to override the documented rights of other ticketed passengers. Patricia Holloway listened to everything without interrupting. When Jack finished, she told him that Sterling Air agreed to all 4 points. Gerald Finch, sitting to her left, said nothing during the meeting, but when it ended and the 3 of them stood to leave, he shook Jack's hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The public apology from Sterling Air's CEO went out the following morning. It named Jack Sullivan. It used the word wrong without qualification and did not reach for regrettable or unfortunate or any of the other words public apologies use when they want to express remorse without fully admitting fault. It said the airline had been wrong, that a passenger had been treated unjustly, and that the people responsible had faced consequences consistent with the severity of what had occurred. The airline also announced a formal revision to its boarding and seating verification policy, effective immediately requiring documented manifest confirmation before any seat reassignment could be initiated, regardless of the passenger's loyalty status or tenure with the airline. The partnership agreement between Jack's company and Sterling Air was finalized the following week in New York in the same meeting room where it had originally been scheduled. The terms were identical to what they had been before any of this happened. Jack had never made the deal contingent on the outcome of the incident, and he did not use it as leverage after. That was not how he operated, and the people across the table from him understood by then that it never would be. David Mercer. The man in the gray jacket who had posted the video received a direct message from Jack 2 weeks after the incident. It was brief. It thanked him for what he had done, and for doing it without being asked. Mercer replied with 3 sentences that he had not expected the video to travel as far as it did that he had posted it, because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be seen, and that he was glad it had mattered. Jack read the message on a Tuesday morning, sitting at a desk in an unremarkable office in Chicago, with a coffee going cold to his left and a full calendar on his screen. He put the phone down and went back to work. He was at 42 a man who had learned that the world does not often reward stillness. People mistake it for passivity, for weakness, for an invitation. What it actually is when it belongs to the right person is a form of precision, knowing exactly how much force a situation requires, and applying nothing more and nothing less. He had not raised his voice in that cabin. He had not made threats or appeals or performances of any kind. He had simply stayed where he was, with the facts in front of him, and waited for the truth to do what it eventually always does when you give it enough room. It catches up.